Welcome back. So we've just got a couple more really fun modes that we can use and play about with. So yesterday's and today's earlier lesson was a little bit more technical, so I hope it was all well explained enough for you. But if you have any questions, I'd love to chat about all of this stuff in our live session tomorrow. So we're going to continue with two techniques that I think are really useful for portrait photography. So most of these are fairly standard, or both of these are fairly standard now across phones, so I hope you're able to find them. But first, let's talk about portrait mode. So this is a relatively recent mode that was introduced to iPhones first, I believe, a couple of years ago, but it's pretty common across all newer smartphones now. So the basic idea behind portrait mode is that it emulates a photography technique called bokeh, which essentially means that part of the image is in clear focus, while the rest, or especially the background, is blurred. So with a DSLR camera, there are actually lots of different ways to create this effect. And they're to do with the lens that you're using, the settings, the exposure, and the distance between you and the subject and the background, and you and the background. So your smartphone doesn't quite have all of these options, although we'll come back to another way of doing this shortly. But with portrait mode, it uses software to create a similar effect. So similar to panorama mode, you just open up your camera and then you scroll to portrait mode. On some Android phones, it may be called something different, like live focus. This mode generally applies the blur straight away, although sometimes you may get a little note at the top that says move closer or further away from your subject, like so. You can then also change the blur and the light settings, so I recommend playing around with them and seeing which looks good on your photo. This is, for example, a photo I just took there. So when do you use portrait mode? I think it's especially useful when there's a busy, messy, or a distracting background, and the blur of the background brings the viewer's attention back to the main subject. So that is, of course, why portrait photography often uses a lot of bokeh. But there are also times when I think it's wise not to use it. So first off, portrait mode doesn't really work all that well in low light. I think this is probably getting better with every new version of a phone as well, but it's something to be mindful of. The other thing to keep in mind is the shape of a subject. So especially if you're taking photos of people, you want to take a look at the hair, and kind of sometimes when you look at portrait modes or photos taken in portrait mode, if you zoom in just a little bit, you see that the edges are kind of imprecise. That's because the software kind of, draws a line around the subject and kind of adds all the blur later. So you just want to make sure that it's not super obvious, because there are, I think, other ways of doing it. So let's move on to one of those other ways of doing it. So that's another feature for today that I actually didn't know about when I first got my phone. But a lot of phones now come with 2 or sometimes even 3 different lenses with different focal lengths, which is quite similar to how with a DSLR camera you might choose a different lens depending on what you're shooting. An easy way to think about this is that they are zoomed in, more or less, which then influences the way the picture looks in terms of depth of field. And we can use this to our advantage, because it can really help us blur out the background as well. So this is what it looks like on my phone, for example. So if you look at the right side of my screen, you can see a ×1 button. So if you're holding your phone vertically instead of horizontally, it'll be on the bottom of your screen. As an aside, sometimes it's not a number, but instead it could be a different sort of symbol, like these symbols on a Samsung, for example. If you click on it like so, you'll notice straight away that the camera is zoomed in more, so you will need to step back to capture the same frame. But how do we get some background blur with this? Partly, it's to do with the aperture of the different lens. Different lenses on our phone have different aperture settings, and this lens that we've changed to, the aperture is bigger, effectively meaning that we already get more background blur. It also has to do with the distance between you and the subject and the background. So you can just kind of try it out on all of these phones. The good thing is with your smartphone, you can already see what the photo will look like in terms of the blur and the background and all of that. So while you move around, you can really kind of try out where you get that background blur. In terms of bokeh, you can even do this if you have only one lens. So for example on an older phone. Although it may be a little bit more tricky and it really depends on your subject. So you should play around with the distance between you and the subject and the background, and essentially you should be as close to the subject as possible so that you can still focus on it, and then have a lot of distance between the subject and the background. So for the task today, I thought we would just do the same as yesterday. So whatever mood you've chosen, try to construct an image that centers that mood. So try some with portrait mode and with the different lenses, if you have them. Or even if you don't have them, try out to get a little bit of background blur just on your usual phone, and then kind of compare them between the portrait mode and non-portrait mode. Just to give you a couple of ideas before we go. If anyone else lives with you, you can ask them to pose for a photo. And you should think about where you want to take this and what would make a cool background, and you can then take a little bit of time to try out the distances between your subject and the background. Obviously, if they're busy or you live alone, that's totally fine as well, because I think it would be really fun to find any other objects in your house that you can work with. So for example, I've got a couple of kind of toys here that I got during different travels, so I'll just kind of see where I can put them to create a fun picture, or I guess it could be a sad picture or an exciting picture, depending on whatever mood you've chosen. But yeah, so I'll leave you with that. So have fun trying out the different settings, and I'll see you tomorrow at the session. I'm really looking forward to chatting to you then.
Zet de goe, zet de vooi, met de lerte hullen tonnen, zet de vooi, gooi. Met de lerte hullen tonnen, zet de goe, zet de vooi, met de lerte hullen tonnen, zet de vooi, gooi. Get de vigna se gost, get de witte gola, get de vigna se gost, get je niet de boze. Get de vigna se gost, get de witte gola, get de vigna se gost, get je niet de boze. Met de lerte hullen tonnen, zet de goe, zet de vooi, met de lerte hullen tonnen, zet de vooi, gooi. Met de lerte hullen tonnen, zet de goe, zet de vooi, met de lerte hullen tonnen, zet de vooi, gooi. Voice ligarido, voice mi scinghi parla a grande piri. Voice ligarido, voice mi scinghi parla a grande piri. Mette lette hullen tonnen, zet de goe, zet de vooi, mette lette hullen tonnen, zet de vooi, gooi. Mette lette hullen tonnen, zet de goe,